What's up guys, welcome to another Tutorial Tuesday. Today's episode, I want to talk about something that's seemingly insignificant, but super important. And that's the histogram. Yeah, that thing, right there. See that? That's a histogram. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about how it's going to help you in camera and in post-production for stills and for videos. The histogram is the most helpful thing ever, but it's often overlooked. So let's get into it. I'm going to use the drift method. Freaking incredible. Round F16 for that to get that sunburst. Alright, so I've been editing for like 2 days straight now and I'm going insane. But this is what happens when you do big events like this. So I've been shooting, I did a mountain bike event and there's one of the shots that I'm doing from it. And it was a 12-hour endurance race and I shot over the course of the 12 hours, I shot 4,500 images, I believe. So I got to go through all those and edit them. Obviously, I'm not going to be editing every single one of them, but I have to sort through them, and I've edited like 500 so far. And basically, this brought my attention to the histogram because I started thinking about it, and my wife walked in and was looking, and she's like, you know, how did you edit all those photos so quickly? And I told her, I said, well, I'm not even really looking at the photo, I'm looking at the histogram. And that just like sparked, well, I need to make a video about that real quick because the histograms have been on my list to do, but this is a perfect example and opportunity. So what is a histogram? Well, it's one of these, and you can see it right there. So the histogram is a graph that shows the light values in an image, and it shows every value from 0 black all the way to the white. And it goes from left to right, where all the way left is solid black and all the way right is solid white, and anything in between is the gray values in between. So the histogram is both on your camera and in post-production software like Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop and Camera Raw. So it can be used in a lot of different ways to analyze light values. Now before I get into the post-production side, which I'm going to spend most of the time in, first, let's talk real quick about how you can utilize the histogram in your camera and why and when you would want to do that. The histogram in the camera is most beneficial outdoors, especially in bright conditions, because you can hardly ever see your LCD screen, or at least you can't see it properly. Like, the values that you're seeing on the LCD screen are not necessarily accurate representative values of the light that's coming into your sensor. So the histogram is really powerful, and no matter how bright it is outside, you can always see the histogram, and you're always going to know if your whites are blown out or your blacks are crushed, and you're always going to see those values. So the histogram is super important when you're shooting outdoors, especially on days like that. If you can see that, it was just super bright and sunny, and I took a couple test shots, used the histogram, and got the values where I needed them to be, got the settings where I needed them to be, and then just started shooting. And it sounds a little boring, and it kind of is from the photography standpoint, but from the biker standpoint, they're all doing this race and they get free images out of this, and it's great for them. But for me editing, I don't want the editing to take longer than necessary. So what I do is I look at the histogram, and to do that, actually, let's jump into the computer and we'll go from there. All right. So I found an image that I haven't worked with yet. Here's the raw image, and here's the next raw image that was in the sequence. This is the one right after this, the one I ended up using. So as you can see, the difference is all I did was tweak this in Camera Raw, and I want this image to look like this image in terms of the light values and the color, saturation, contrast, all that stuff. So let's open that up. Oh, I already had an image in there. Okay, here we go. So here's the image, opened up. This is the raw file. Now here's the histogram, and this is looking pretty crazy. First thing, real quick, there is a couple different types of histograms. Well, it's the same histogram, but there's a couple different kinds of things that you can show on the histogram. This gray area, the white stuff there, is the overall luminance, the black and white values of the light. This is obviously the color stuff, so you can add the color spectrum in there to see what colors are clipping, or you can look at the overall thing, which is the white area, and that's the area I'm going to be most concerned with right now. So the first thing that you can tell right off the bat is you can see this here. There are right in this section, if you look on the black, you can see that the black is shoved up against this vertical axis here. So what that's telling me is that there are areas probably in these dark shadows and maybe on her somewhere in certain areas that are the blacks are crushed. And then you can see right here on the white values, there are areas of this image where the whites are crushed. And if you want to know where those areas are specifically, you can come up here and you can click the highlight clipping warning. So that'll show you. So these red areas are all the areas where the highlights are clipped. Now you can click the shadow clipping warning. And so I told you some of those were crushed, and you can see that in the blue right here. So that's kind of faint, but it's there. So it's not much. So you can see all of those blue areas are the where the blacks are crushed. And all of these red areas are where the whites are crushed. So a little bit on her helmet, a lot on her fork, and then some blacks crushed in the shadows. So I want to fix that. And I don't want to just play around until it looks good to my eye. All I have to do is immediately, I know I can go straight over here and drop those highlights down. And if I drop them right there to -55, every single highlight is now brought back into the spectrum of not being crushed. And that's exactly, if I take it too far, then you see, look right here when I do it again, look at her helmet. So her helmet is a white helmet. And the more I drag it down, the grayer it gets because I'm darkening those highlights. And that's a little too much because now you can see, it's really hard to tell, but now if you look real closely, you can see that the highlights are not touching the edge right here. So the white highlights there are not all the way. So what that means is that I've slid the highlights so far that the actual white is not white anymore. It's a lower value than actual pure white. And I want it to be perfect. So I'm going to slide it back up until I hit that edge. So the very edge of my histogram of the values is hitting the very edge of the right side, which is perfect white. So that means this area is going to be perfect white and the helmet is more accurate. Now let's do the same thing for the shadows. I don't want to play around with looking at it and guessing. I just want to bring those up a bit. So actually first I'm going to bring up the blacks. So I'm going to bring up the blacks until there. That's the look that I want. I don't want any of the blacks to be smashed up against that wall. If I do it too much, you see that now that's showing me all of the clipping there. Let's take that off. So now you can see that this is super crushed, and that's what that means. That big black line that's spiking straight up, that is all of this area that was close to black is now beyond black. That means there's no detail left in those blacks. So that's my histogram, and that's how I use it to very quickly and accurately get my proper exposure to where I want it. Also, when you change things like contrast, you're changing all of that. And the more things that you do to an image, the more it changes. So another thing that I do is I remove, I do these and I enable my profile corrections. So when you do that, most of the time when you enable a lens profile correction, that is going to brighten it up because it's going to get rid of the vignetting and it's going to re-warp the image to get rid of the lens warping, if there is any. And a lot of times that will overexpose your image. Well, that will make it brighter in some ways, and it did, because see how I had already adjusted my highlights and now they're brighter again. So now I need to bring them back again. So I need to tone them down just a little bit. And the black, see, it brought more of this curve here is going more this way, and it's going more into the mid grays, and I don't want that. I want a little more contrast in it to be a little darker. I want it to be a little closer to that line. So now I can just back the blacks off a bit until you see that little spark right there, that little line come up. I want it right in there. So now this is a nice even curve with these darker areas going towards black, but there's still detail in there, and that's perfect. Alright, so that was the histogram in Camera Raw, and if you're in Lightroom, then Camera Raw is integrated into it, so there's really no difference. But let's look at something real quick in Photoshop. So I'm going to open up this, because I already did. Here's just a JPEG that I just edited. Alright, so another way that you can use the histogram actually in Photoshop is when you're doing adjustment layers. So here is the levels layer, and that will show me my histogram, and I can pick between RGB, which is the full light spectrum, or I can pick the individual spectrums. These are the reds, the greens, and the blues, and I can tweak those values, but I'm going to leave it on RGBs. So this is in Photoshop. If I decided, I decide it needs a little more contrast, then I can bring up these black values, and I'm telling the camera that I want this black value that was here, I want it to be moved to everything that is here. And if I push it too hard, then you see all those darker areas. It's basically going to move this histogram everything this way. So it's going to crush all of the things that are closest to black. So now the other more powerful one here would be the curves. And again, this is the same histogram, it's the same light values, it's just you're seeing it a little bit differently. So you can make this however you want so you can see it, but you'll notice it's the exact same. The light values are the same, they haven't changed. So with the curves, the same thing. If I want to change the blacks and crush them a bit more, I can take this point and drag it in and say, okay, now the new black starts here. So everything from here, everything at this point is now black. Everything past this point is beyond black. It's black, but there's no detail in it anymore. So I don't want that. The same thing with whites. If I bring it over this way, then you can see I'm getting blown out there and here and everywhere. So that's changing those values. And then of course, with the curves, you can do your traditional S-curve. If I decide I want a little more contrast, then there you have it. But now the light values are changed. And a great way to see that is if I add on top of that another here, now you can see there's broken bits, and this is really helpful. This will let you know the data that is being broken, and that this was the result of the changes that I made in this. So this S-curve here resulted in these changes, which you can now see. So that's a good way to always monitor what you're doing, and everything that you do will probably, especially when you're doing levels and curves and saturation and contrast and all that, will affect everything else. So it's not just a one and done thing. You don't just look at your histogram and then do something and then think, oh, it's good. Every time you do something, you check your histogram again and make sure you're not crushing anything or blowing anything out, unless that's what you're artistically going for. All right, that was a lot. I think we're done here. Let's hop out of the computer now. All right, so that's the histogram. That's kind of the basics of it, and those are the ways that I use it the most, both in the camera and in post-production. There's a lot of other ways that you can use a histogram, and a lot of other things that it has that you can go into, but that's for another tutorial. So this was just kind of the basics to get you familiar with what it is, how and when and why you would want to use it. So if you like that tutorial and you want to see more of it, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if you have any questions about any of the things that I talked about in the histogram, or what they mean, or anything else that you want to know, make sure you leave those in the comments below. Hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.